Hi guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Petla, aka Mr. Pro Shot, and welcome back to the Pro View. So in today's YouTube video, we're going to be talking about what is ISO and how does it impact your photography. So as you know, ISO forms one of the three pillars of photography, or it forms part of the exposure triangle, which has your shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So ISO forms is part of that triangle, or the pillars, one of the three pillars of photography. So today also we're going to learn how does ISO affect your photography. What is ISO? In very basic terms, ISO is simply a camera setting that will brighten or darken a photo. As you increase your ISO number, your photo will grow in brightness. So basically, as in layman's term, is that if you increase your ISO, your photo will become brighter. If you decrease your ISO, your photo will be darker. So the lower the ISO you have, the darker your picture is. The higher the ISO you have, the more brighter your picture will be. However, raising your ISO has consequences. A photo taken at too high of an ISO will show a lot of grain, also known as noise, and may not be usable. So if you raise your ISO too high, like for instance, if you take your ISO all the way to 64,000 in certain cameras, the pictures won't be usable. There'll be way too much noise in the picture for you to be able to use the picture. The picture won't be crystal clear and sharp. It's going to have a lot of noise that it just makes your picture unusable. Some people like their pictures like that, especially some people do intentionally put noise into their picture. But if you did not want to intentionally have noise in your picture, that noise is going to be disturbing to you. What is the meaning of ISO? The acronym ISO stands for International Organization for Standardization. So yeah, that is the meaning of ISO. It is International Organization for Standardization. That is the meaning of it. So yeah, it's something simple as that. I know there's more information. You can, if you want to know more information about what it actually means and how did they come to the name ISO, you can go check on the internet exactly what is the history behind it. I just gave you what the acronym stands for. Common ISO values that you might find in cameras. Let me just put here that every different camera manufacturer might have their own type of ISO ranges that you might find in their camera, but the ones that I'm about to list now are the ones that you might find in common in almost every camera. You have your ISO 100, which would be considered your low ISO. You have ISO 200, ISO 400, ISO 800, ISO 1600, ISO 3200, and ISO 6400, which would be considered a high ISO. Okay, so the next thing we're going to be having a look at is what is base ISO. So base ISO is your lowest native ISO of your camera. Some cameras might have a low native ISO of 100, and others might have a low base native ISO of 200. So the reason for knowing what is your native base ISO is to know how far you can push your camera, because they always say when it comes to photography, you're better off shooting at the lowest ISO possible than shooting at a higher ISO, because once you start to increase the ISO, once you go up to higher ISOs, as we were saying, ISO 6000, 6400, you start to introduce noise into your picture. So the higher quality, you get higher quality pictures from your camera when you're shooting at your base ISO, your lowest base ISO. So for instance, if you're shooting at 100 in pure sunlight, daylight, you're going to get the best quality picture out of your camera because you're shooting at the lowest ISO. Because as soon as you start to increase your ISO, you start to introduce noise into your picture, and noise makes your picture a bit blurry, doesn't make it as sharp as it could be. You should always try to stick to the base ISO to get the highest image quality. That's true. You should always try to stick to your base ISO to get the best image quality out of your camera. But sometimes it's not always possible for you to stick to your lowest base ISO because of the lighting condition in the environment that you're going to be shooting in. Especially when it comes to, as I keep saying in many of my videos, especially when it comes to event photography, when you're at a location different locations where probably you don't have as much natural light coming into the venue, and it's at night, they don't have sufficient lighting for your camera. You might need to bump up your ISO from ISO 100 to maybe ISO 1600, depending on the camera that you're using. If you're using a good high-end professional camera, you can potentially get away with shooting with ISO 3200 or more, even ISO 6400 if it's really needed. If the situation is very desperate, it's very dark, you can probably get away with ISO 6400, but ideally try to keep it under ISO 1600. That's the range you want to keep it under. And then if you can, if you have like strobe lights, or flash, on camera flash, you can go down to maybe ISO 500 because you have light to fill up the room. So the next thing I'm going to be talking about is low versus high ISO noise visibility. I'm going to give you guys an example of a picture that we're going to have here below. One has a low ISO and one has a high ISO. So if you see the picture on my left hand side, it has an ISO of 200, and the picture on my right hand side has an ISO of 3200. So the picture that has an ISO of 200, you can see that the skin is clear, there's no noise, it's perfectly sharp, it's in detail. Whereas you can see the picture on my right hand side, which has the ISO is ISO 3200, you can start to see that there is what we call noise in it. The picture is starting to break up a bit. It's not as crystal clear as you'd want it to be. So that's the noise. So ideally you'd want to make sure that you're shooting at a low ISO, that you don't have the noise that you have in the picture that was shot at ISO 3200. You want the picture that was shot at ISO 200 to reduce the amount of noise that you have in your picture. And other ways you can avoid shooting at high ISOs like that is adding external flash, adding external light. Like I was saying, you can add an on-camera flash or an off-camera flash to add more light for you to be able to shoot at lower ISOs. To maximize your image quality, here are 4 steps that you should follow to maximize the image quality of your camera while using ISO. Select the aperture setting that will provide you the desired depth of field that you want. So select the aperture or your f-stop that's going to provide you the type of depth of field that you want to have in the image. So if you select that, for instance, if you select a wide open aperture, it's going to let in more light. The more light that your aperture is letting in, the lower the ISO you're going to use on your camera. So if you can go all the way wide open on your aperture, it will help you to use less. It will help you to use a lower ISO like ISO 200 or ISO 500. Number 2 is set your ISO to its base value and put your shutter speed to whatever setting provides the proper exposure. So basically put your ISO to its base value, so your either ISO 100 or ISO 200, and then start to play around with your shutter to get the right exposure that you think is going to work for the shot. So basically first choose your ISO and then you're going to adjust your shutter speed around that. Number 3 is if your subject is blurry, progressively raise your ISO and use faster shutter speed until motion blur disappears. So basically if your subject is blurry because you had a low ISO, and because if you have a low ISO and the room you're in is dark, you're going to have a low shutter speed trying to get the exposure that you're trying to get. So basically what you need to do is increase your ISO, because if you increase your ISO by like 2 stops or 3 stops, basically like that would mean going from ISO 100 to ISO 800. It will help you to get a faster shutter speed because you can increase your shutter speed by some, I don't remember what is exactly the science of the speeds of your shutter speed, but you can increase your shutter speed by probably a lot. By a lot, Fence. Yes, by a lot. Number 3, if your subject is blurry, progressively raise your ISO and use a faster shutter speed until motion blur disappears. Yes, if you have a blurry subject because of the low shutter speed you're using, you would use your ISO to increase your shutter speed. So you would increase your ISO by probably 2 or 3 stops depending on the lighting situation you have there, and then you would be able to increase your shutter speed. because the reason you would have motion blur is that you're shooting at a slow shutter speed, trying to capture as much light into your sensor, because you had not increased your ISO. So if you increase your ISO, you're able to shoot at a higher shutter speed than you were. That will reduce the motion blur that you were getting. Okay, going to number 4. Number 4, if your ISO is getting too high and you still have the ability to use a wider aperture, open it up until the ISO gets to more manageable level, even if it means sacrificing some of your desired depth of field. Yes, that does make sense. Sometimes you find that your ISO is running too high, probably like you had a night shoot and your ISO is running at 6400. You might want to say, okay, instead of me just being able to photograph these specific people, like being able to photograph a whole group, you might need to sacrifice your depth of field, just being able to photograph maybe two people. That means you need to open your aperture all the way to whatever wide open it is. So probably f1.4. You would use the example of you were shooting at f8, and then you're like, okay, I need to sacrifice the fact that I was able to shoot full group shots to probably shooting maybe 3 or 4 people at f1.4, because I want to get more light going into my lens by having my aperture wide open, for me to reduce my ISO, because you'd rather have a lower aperture than have a higher ISO, because with a lower aperture, at least you're still going to get things, you're still going to be able to get certain things in the middle of the picture fully in focus and sharp. Whereas if you have a high ISO, you're going to have a lot of noise in your picture, which is going to ruin your picture. It's going to create aberrations and other things that you don't want to see in your picture. So guys, so that brings us to the end of this video, where I was teaching you guys, explaining to you guys what is ISO, how does it work, and how does it impact your pictures, guys. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy this video, guys, please do leave a like and a comment, and please do subscribe to my YouTube channel. That helps out a lot. Yeah, so guys, I'm guessing I'll catch you guys in the next video. Until then, it's been Fence Petla, aka Mr. Pro Shot. I'll catch you guys in the next video.